the 1930s, the United Kingdom had a total Jewish population of around 300,000. At least that's the number given in the American Jewish Yearbook. Most of the data from the 1931 census was destroyed in a fire. But if that 300,000 is remotely accurate, Britain would have had the 10th largest Jewish population in the world. Nearly 200,000 lived in London, primarily concentrated in the boroughs of Stepney and Shoreditch. But sizable communities could be found in the neighbouring county of Kent, most major cities, and several small towns in southwestern England and Wales. In Britain, the last forms of legal discrimination against Jews had been abolished by 1871. The 1910s saw the first Jewish cabinet ministers, and during the First World War, Jewish Australian General John Monash became a favourite of King George V. 2 Jewish athletes won medals for Britain at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, and in 1924, runner Harold Abrahams won a gold and silver in Paris. After working all over Europe and America, Jewish filmmaker Alexander Korda became a British citizen and directed The Private Life of Henry VIII, which flopped in Britain but was a huge hit abroad, won the Oscar for Best Picture of 1933, and launched the Hollywood career of actor Charles Laughton. The same year, Essex cinema magnate Sidney Bernstein helped actors and filmmakers fleeing Nazi Germany find new jobs in Britain and America. During the struggle for emancipation, most Jews had supported the Liberal Party, but with political equality achieved, an influx of working-class refugees from the Russian Empire, and the rise of the Labour Party, Jewish voters of the 1920s and 30s fell predictably along lines of social class, which is honestly a testament to emancipation's success. By 1936, there were 20 Jews in the House of Commons and 9 in the House of Lords, though keep in mind the British Parliament was and is gigantic. Probably the most famous was Leslie Hoare Belisha, transport minister and author of numerous road safety laws. Nevertheless, hatred for Jews could still be found in the open. In a country more divided by class than by race, ethnic discrimination in housing, employment, and university admissions was less common and less pronounced than in other English-speaking countries, but it wasn't non-existent. In 1903, Irish migrants rioted against Jewish ironworkers in the Welsh town of Dowlais. Facing pressure from the left and the right, Arthur Balfour's government passed the Aliens Act 1905, which, though not discriminatory on paper, was nevertheless wielded to put an end to large-scale Jewish immigration. In August 1911, the breakaway Independent Labour Party led an anti-Semitic pogrom in Tredegar. And in the 1912 Marconi scandal, 4 cabinet ministers were accused of insider trading, including Jewish ministers Herbert Samuel and Sir Rufus Isaacs. A Catholic weekly called The New Witness was quick to single the Jews out, suggesting that the government as a whole had been corrupted by a Jewish conspiracy. A parliamentary inquiry cleared the men of wrongdoing, and the editor of The New Witness was convicted of criminal libel, but with so many acts of overt anti-Semitism across the classes, it's perhaps understandable that India Secretary Edwin Montagu opposed Britain's endorsement of a Jewish home in Palestine for fear that it would encourage the expulsion of Jews from Britain. The First World War went some way towards stigmatizing anti-Semitism, but it didn't exactly disappear from polite society. It just became less casual and more professionalized. But before talking about that, we need to understand what the country was going through at the time. Although Britain won the First World War, she still came out of the conflict in a worse position than before. The already fraying empire was further burdened by the addition of 6 League of Nations mandates, including an apparently ungovernable Palestine, the loss of Ireland, and an increasingly resilient independence movement in India. The domestic economy was in shambles. Nearly 2% of the national population had died in the war. Even more were left disabled and unable to work. And the end of the wartime economy meant less foreign demand for British industry, resulting in mass layoffs. This was partly offset by the introduction of unemployment insurance and a shortened work week, but unemployment remained high. More concerned with inflation than joblessness, Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill reinstated the gold standard in 1925, surging the value of the pound and tanking the already weak export market. The government endeavored to make up the difference by gutting public spending and trying to mandate lower wages, but this only provoked a general strike and a near mutiny in the Navy. In May 1929, the chaos helped propel Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party into government, but they found themselves holding the bag 5 months later with the start of the Great Depression, popularly known in Britain as the Slump. Lacking an outright majority in Parliament, the king urged MacDonald to restore public confidence and prevent the mass exodus of British capital by forming a unity government with the Liberals and Conservatives. This was probably a mistake, as both Labour and the Liberals promptly expelled their leaders, splitting the parties in two and all but guaranteeing a Conservative landslide in 1931. Labour rebounded in 1935, with new leader Clement Attlee campaigning on expanded access to secondary education, public housing, a national health service, and the wholesale nationalization of major industries and utilities. New Liberal leader Herbert Samuel offered a platform similar to the American New Deal, bailing out the public, reforming the financial sector, and stimulating the economy through public works. But vote splitting continued to ensure a majority for the Conservatives. Returning Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was sympathetic to the plight of the average citizen, but didn't consider it his place to address it head-on. A fretful, indecisive man, Baldwin was quick to defer to his junior ministers, who advanced a mix of token reforms and ruthless austerity measures. At the very least, the rising tide of fascism in Europe had convinced the Conservatives to rebuild the military, but the continuation of austerity in all other sectors pushed a growing number of Britons to political extremes. Long-term joblessness brought renewed attention to the British Communists, but their reach was hampered by their overt affiliation with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin and their refusal to cooperate with any other party. Though a visible presence in the newspapers, London, and certain corners of Scotland and Wales, they could only scrounge up 0.1% of the vote and a single seat in the 1935 elections. But this was the 1930s, and it wasn't just the communists. Even if we assume all 27,000 communist voters were party members, they were still outnumbered by the 40,000 or so who'd found a home in British fascism. British fascists arrived second only to those of Italy, first taking shape as the Britons in July 1919. Much like Italy's fascists, the Britons coalesced out of frustration that their country had won the First World War, but, except for some minor territorial gains, ended up worse off than before. For a variety of historical reasons, anti-Semitism wasn't a huge factor in Italian fascism, but the Britons and like-minded groups were also influenced by German Völkisch, whose ideas would soon form an integral part of Nazism. Unlike the communists, the fascists were enthralled by the concept of empire, and thus attributed the empire's decline to a nebulous Jewish conspiracy. So too did they apply this theory to the changing face of British politics, particularly the rise of Labour, and really any facet of modern world history which the authors of the party's countless manifestos happened to dislike. The Meiji Restoration, the Ku Klux Klan, the Jesuits, all Jewish conspiracies against Britain. Truly, they had an answer for everything. Britain's founder Henry Hamilton Beamish claimed to have uncovered a global Jewish conspiracy to destroy the British Empire while fighting Boer insurgents in South Africa during the First World War, though it's unclear exactly how one would lead to the other. Shortly after the party's founding, Beamish made headlines by printing an inflammatory campaign poster accusing First Commissioner of Works Alfred Mond of treason on no evidence other than the fact that he was Jewish. When Mond sued for libel and won, Beamish evaded his court-ordered payout by fleeing the country, getting in early on Nazism, and eventually settling in southern Rhodesia. The Britons ran on a platform of ending all immigration, banning immigrants and children of immigrants from voting, serving in the military, or holding public office, creating a registry of foreigners, including some native-born Britons, to be placed under surveillance, and expelling all Jews from Britain to be resettled in either Palestine or Madagascar. They were exactly the people you'd imagine. Homeopaths, occultists, disgruntled ex-military officers, failed parliamentary candidates who'd fallen out of favor with the major parties, and decrepit old aristocrats that nobody had heard from for decades. And this was ultimately their undoing. By 1931, the movement had basically devolved into an indie publishing house for anti-Semitic propaganda. The ideology was never enough. Fascism demands a cult of personality. British fascism needed a star. In 1922, Oswald Mosley became the youngest member of Parliament at just 26. Originally a conservative, Mosley's growing interest in the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes prompted him to switch to Labour. Under Prime Minister MacDonald, he served as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a vestigial position that basically amounted to an extra vote in cabinet meetings. Ironically, it was Mosley who kept getting outvoted in those meetings, but powerless as it was, a cabinet position still gave him enough clout to break away from Labour in 1930 and form the New Party, which initially embraced Keynesian economics before sliding into fascist-friendly economic corporatism. As we've already established, the 1931 election was a disaster for anyone but the Conservatives, and the New Party didn't win any seats, but it still helped Mosley in two ways. The election happened to take place just as earlier fascist groups like the Britons were collapsing. In 1932, Mosley published his manifesto, The Greater Britain, which combined corporatism, Keynesianism, social credit, and imperial autarky. And in October of that year, the new party reorganized as the British Union of Fascists, commonly nicknamed the Blackshirts for their distinctive turtleneck uniforms. The 1931 campaign also attracted the attention of tabloid magnate Lord Rothermere, who'd spent the previous decade transforming the already reactionary Daily Mail into a mouthpiece for Italian fascism and began courting Mosley. With the aid of the Daily Mail, party membership surged to roughly 40,000. This was as successful as the BUF would ever be. Much of Mosley's appeal had come from his assertion that Britain's capitalist economy would collapse beyond recovery at any moment. But however badly the government handled the Depression, that never happened. In 1934, it even slightly rebounded, and Lord Rothermere immediately regretted his earlier decision. That July, he withdrew his financial support and his endorsement, taking much of the Daily Mail's readership with him. Faced with a dramatic change in fortune even before their first election, Mosley began re-examining the BUF strategy. Not only could they not rely on historical inevitability to sweep them into power, but they faced stiff competition from the Imperial Fascist League. The two parties had discussed merging in the past, but the differences between them were too great, not least their respective positions on the Jewish question. The IFL had wholeheartedly embraced German Nazism, with all the anti-Semitism that came with it. But the BUF had avoided Jew baiting and even had a few Jewish members, like former boxing champion Ted Lewis. But in October 1934, Mosley made a speech at the Royal Albert Hall promoting anti-Semitism as a key part of the Blackshirt agenda. Though this provoked an exodus of people like Lewis, Mosley reasoned that this short-term loss would be offset by an influx of enthusiastic anti-Semites. But that never happened either. The Union continued to hemorrhage money and support. Regional offices closed, and the Union's ability to propagandize through public events was neutered by a rapid response protest organized by Jewish groups, trade unions, and the Communists. Ultimately, the party decided not to contest the 1935 election. But if those protests were successful in neutralizing the BUF's recruitment, they also convinced the most rabid anti-Semites in the party that they'd been right about the Jews all along, propelling extreme Jew baiters like William Joyce to the forefront of the movement. The Blackshirts were taking to the streets. Now, Blackshirt paramilitaries had clashed with political opponents before, at Stockton in 1933 and at Worthing and Kensington Olympia in 1934. The first two confrontations were defeats for the BUF, who abandoned operations in those cities permanently. In fact, the Blackshirts soon shut down their paramilitary wing because it was too expensive to maintain. But this actually opened up new doors for them, improving their relations with local police and giving the party plausible deniability to operate in the open without being condemned as aggressors. This is a classic trick. We're just having a fun stroll through a neighborhood full of people we proclaim are less than human. If they react in anger, it's their own fault. But once again, political winds weren't kind to the Blackshirts. In October 1935, Fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia, attracting shamefully little response from the League of Nations and most of the world powers, but it alerted many around the world to the true threat posed by fascism. If trade union leaders and the tiny Communist Party could already mobilize to confront the fascists, imagine what could happen once the war in Ethiopia started activating normies. On the 25th of May 1936, Mosley held a rally in Oxford, only to find the venue packed with protesters who drowned out his speech. The Blackshirts responded by assaulting Scottish journalist Basil Murray, at which point trade unionists jumped in and sent 4 fascists to the hospital. Unaccountably, only Murray was convicted of breaching the peace. Nevertheless, the protest was a success. The Blackshirts never returned to Oxford. 2.5 weeks later, the BUF tried to do the same by recruiting miners in the Welsh town of Tonopandi, only for locals to drive them out of town in just half an hour. And in September, the BUF led a night of terror in the mostly Jewish Leylands district of Leeds, only for 1,000 marching Blackshirts to be met the next day by 30,000 anti-fascists. 14 of the fascists were injured, including Mosley himself. All of these incidents followed the same playbook. The Blackshirts would go into an area where they knew they were unpopular as a stunt. Protesters would disrupt the BUF event, but keep it peaceful until the Blackshirts used the protest itself as a justification to jump in with brass knuckles, clubs, cudgels, and broken bottles. When the protesters fought back, the BUF would then play the victim in their party propaganda. But this never worked. While it's true that the protesters were mostly leftists, they were also mostly locals who could tell their friends and family what had happened and relay their stories in the local press, whereas the BUF were mostly outsiders who'd come into town as a deliberate provocation. Though they could still find a few hundred well-wishers around the country, they were increasingly confined to London. What's more, the protesters were no longer just politically savvy activists. Throughout 1936, a surge of new groups formed to organize against the Blackshirts, while some pre-existing organizations, like the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the National Council for Civil Liberties, lent a hand. By July, 86 different organizations were coordinating against the BUF in London alone. Even gangsters were starting to pitch in, as local Jewish enforcer Jack Spot Comer had a well-earned reputation for being ready to go whenever someone in the community had trouble, even if he did start charging a £10 protection fee. Conspicuously absent from the fight were the major political parties. To be clear, plenty of Labour, Liberal, and Conservative MPs were committed opponents of the BUF, but Parliament itself wasn't about to step in, especially when the fascist threat seemed to be taking care of itself, and when Whitehall was plenty busy with military rearmament, increasingly fragile geopolitics, and an emerging constitutional crisis surrounding the new king. But by September, it was clear that something big was coming. Blackshirts had already spent weeks attacking Jewish homes and businesses in the dark of night. And on the 26th, this was confirmed when the BUF announced a series of marches between events held all over East London to be held on the 4th of October, the 4th anniversary of the party's founding. The significance of their chosen locations wasn't lost on anyone. The BUF's headquarters had always been located in West London, and while the party enjoyed more support in the East End than you might expect, their focus on heavily Jewish Stepney was an obvious provocation. In response, several East London officials, including 5 borough mayors, presented Home Secretary John Simon with a 100,000 signature petition for the government to ban the marches. Simon, though an opponent of the BUF and their tactics, declined to intervene. The march would take place on Sunday. 6,000 police officers were allocated to separate the Blackshirts from any possible counter-protests. On Saturday, the Labour Party, Bethnal Green Borough Council, and Jewish People's Council Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism issued warnings to stay home and avoid the streets on the day. But that isn't what happened. In the early afternoon, 3,000 Blackshirts met under police protection at Tower Hill, planning to split into 4 columns and march through the East End to separate events at Limehouse, Bow, Victoria Park Square, and Ask Street. But upon reaching Gardiner's Corner at Aldgate, the way was shut. While most of East London's institutions had discouraged people from lingering in the streets, the Communist Party had put out flyers urging as many people as possible to come out and block strategic points all over the East End. Gardiner's Corner was the most important, as it blocked several of the main routes. The Communists had appointed themselves as leaders, but they didn't make up the majority of protesters. They couldn't. There were more protesters at Gardiner's Corner than there were Communists in all of Britain. Anglican priests, union workers, even reformed ex-fascists who knew the tactics of the Blackshirts well. Tram drivers had abandoned their vehicles in the streets to be used as barricades. The Jewish Ex-Servicemen's Association, clad in their medals, had gone through the streets inviting others to join them, as had the Independent Labour Party, which had long since abandoned its anti-Semitic stance and gone through the streets in a van with a loudspeaker calling people to come out. After refusing to disperse, thousands of police officers fell on the crowd, sending several dozen to the hospital or to improvised triage units scattered throughout the area. As news of the violence spread, more residents arrived. Altogether, between 100,000 and 300,000 people answered the call, staking their claim somewhere in the East End to prevent the passage of the 3,000 fascists. Within minutes, the police concluded that passage through Gardener's Corner was impossible. Instead, they would have to clear a way for the Blackshirts to bypass the protests by diverting far to the south, via the narrow, winding Cable Street. Unbeknownst to them, Cable Street had been cut off for hours. Early in the morning, Irish dock workers had arrived in tribute to the Jewish workers who'd supported their strike 24 years earlier, tearing up paving stones and scattering broken glass to stop the mounted police while erecting 3 large barricades from lumber, corrugated iron, and an upturned lorry. While police slowly attempted to dismantle the barricades, the fascists crowded in behind them chanting party slogans, while Cable Street residents, taking advantage of the old thoroughfare's infamous coziness, began raining household items down on them. The police took down the first barricade, but not before several of them were captured by protesters. Upon reaching the second barricade, the Commissioner of Police admitted defeat and ordered Mosley to take his followers back to West London. Victorious, the protesters began decamping for Victoria Park, planned site of the largest fascist rally, to celebrate. The battle was over before sunset. Hilariously, a group of Blackshirts in Bow kept waiting for Mosley into the evening, unaware of anything that had taken place. 175 people are recorded as having been injured, mostly anti-fascists, but some fascists as well, and some police who'd been assaulted by both sides. At least 79 anti-fascists were arrested for their activity, along with 6 fascists, and the organizations that had come together in protest began organizing legal aid. Several dozen protesters were convicted and either fined or imprisoned, but they knew the risk, and those who went on to talk about it didn't seem to have any regrets. Initially, the incident gained the British Union of Fascists 2,000 new members. Just a week after the battle, 200 young Blackshirts orchestrated a retribution attack against Jewish businesses on Mile End Road, torching cars, wounding several men with razor blades, and throwing a hairdresser and a little girl through a plate glass window. But this bump in enthusiasm only lasted a few weeks. By the year's end, membership had fallen to just 16,000. Humiliated by their previous inaction, Parliament passed the Public Order Act 1936, which outlawed party paramilitaries and political uniforms. Though the BUF weren't the only group to feature uniformed thugs, the bill was clearly targeted towards them, and in the 90 years since, it's mostly been used against fascists and neo-fascists. Ironically, forcing the BUF to abandon its strategy of agitation actually helped bring back many of the middle-class business owners who'd abandoned them. But that isn't saying much. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the BUF's membership had only risen to 22,500. By this time, a nationalist junta backed by Germany, Italy, and Portugal had seized power across much of Spain, plunging the country into civil war. Britain didn't officially take a side in the conflict, but as many as 4,000 British citizens volunteered to support the Republic, which put even more Britons in an anti-fascist mood, to say nothing of fascist Japan's invasion of China the following year, or Nazi Germany's continued provocations in Central Europe. While all of this had been going on, Edward VIII had succeeded his father as king, only to abdicate the throne in December in order to marry Wallis Simpson, an American commoner whose status as a divorcee conflicted with the king's role as head of the Church of England. This was an unprecedented event in modern British history, but King Edward had a long-running reputation as a flake, and it was something of an open secret that he was sterile, so his abandonment of the throne wasn't quite as shocking as it could have been. The throne passed to his brother, who became King George VI. The following year, however, the restyled Duke of Windsor scandalized the nation when he and Wallis visited Germany as honored guests of Adolf Hitler. Though popular culture has exaggerated the Nazis' interest in Edward, he was absolutely a Nazi sympathizer who favored an alliance between their two countries. And despite public statements to the contrary, private conversations and declassified documents reveal that he never stopped. During the war, Westminster all but exiled him from Europe as governor of the Bahamas, and he spent most of his life afterward in France. Suffering from burnout and having successfully navigated the government through the abdication crisis, Stanley Baldwin stepped down as Prime Minister in favor of Chancellor of the Exchequer Neville Chamberlain. John Simon became the new Chancellor, and Leslie Hoare-Belisha became War Secretary. Baldwin was quite popular as he left office and used his popularity to advocate for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, though his reputation soured over the years due to the aforementioned austerity measures, as well as his relative naivety towards the threat of Nazi aggression. Though it may have abandoned Mosley, the Daily Mail continued as Britain's biggest cheerleader for Hitler and Mussolini. So enthusiastic was the paper in its support that it convinced German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop that the British public were mostly pro-Nazi and would never pose a threat to Germany. I don't know what they do now. The Communist Party of Great Britain was never able to translate its effectiveness on the street into electoral success, though I get the impression that they've taken more credit for the Battle of Cable Street than they deserve. In 1945, they received 98,000 votes and 2 seats in Parliament, but that was the best they could ever do. Their association with the brutal Soviet regime, refusal to cooperate with any other party, and the onset of the Cold War relegated them to a fringe status which continues to this day. William Joyce fled to Germany when the Second World War broke out, broadcasting propaganda to Allied prisoners of war in English under the pseudonym Lord Haw-Haw. Turns out, Mr. England for the English here was an Irish-American illegal immigrant who'd falsified documents to acquire a British passport. But the court ruled that that was British enough to hang. He was the last person ever to be executed for treason in the United Kingdom. Gangster Jack Comer was sentenced to 6 months in prison for causing grievous bodily harm to one of the Blackshirts, the only sentence he ever served. He went into the army for the first 4 years of the war and continued his career in London's criminal underworld after, but I hesitate to say more as I suspect this isn't the last we'll see of him. Incredibly, I could say the same of Oswald Mosley. This is not the end of his story. But that'll have to wait. Britain and the world were heading towards war. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.